Do you think you have what it takes to solve the hardest reading questions on the digital SAT? I'm Nathan Greenberg, founder of Ivy League Mentors, and I've been teaching SAT since before many of my viewers were even born. And for this video, I've collected 7 of the hardest reading questions to ever appear on the digital SAT. Now, before we begin, I should note that hard is subjective. You may not consider all of these questions hard, and there may be other questions that you think are harder. That said, all of the questions I've selected are rated a 3 out of 3 in terms of difficulty by the College Board, the company that makes the SAT. And I've seen a lot of students get them wrong in the classes that I teach, so I think it's safe to assume that they are among the hardest questions out there. If you're up for a challenge, then stick around. Now, before we get to our first question, I'd like to emphasize that I'm not just going to be explaining the answers to these questions. I'm actually going to be walking you through the steps that I would use to solve them. And I think that's a lot more helpful because on the actual test, you're unlikely to see an old question repeated. So the actual answer doesn't matter very much. But you will see questions like these, and if you want to solve them correctly on the real test, you'll want a good approach, which is something I'm hoping this video can help you develop. That said, if you'd like to try solving the questions yourself before I walk through them, feel free to hit that pause button as soon as the question appears, and give yourself a moment to work through it first yourself. Now let's get to it. I'm going to begin by reading the question. Which choice most effectively uses data from the table to complete the statement? Now this tells me that the important part of the text is the statement that appears in the final sentence. But because the text is relatively short, and I might need some context to complete the statement, I'm going to read it from the beginning. However, I'm not going to worry too much about the details. Instead, I'm going to focus on the overall flow of the text, and especially transitional words and phrases that can provide clues about how to complete the statement. Over the past 200 years, the percentage of the population employed in the agricultural sector has declined in both France and the United States, while employment in the service sector, which includes jobs in retail, consulting, real estate, etc., has risen. However, this transition happened at very different rates in the two countries. This can be seen most clearly by comparing the employment by sector in both countries in blank. So having read the passage, a key word in the last sentence is this. This refers to what comes before, which is the idea that in both the United States and France, agriculture has declined and service has increased. But the rate of that change is different. That means that the correct answer will show us a rapid or significant change in one of those countries and a slow or small change in the other. Now that we know what to look for, we can run through our answers one by one and check them against the graph and our expectations, comparing France and the United States between the years given. Let's start with A. Looking at the graph, we can see that between 1900 and 1950 in France, agriculture fell a little, and services rose a little. And between those dates in the United States, agriculture fell a lot, and services also rose a lot. So we see the same general trend in both countries. Agriculture is decreasing and services is increasing, but it's happening at different rates, which is exactly what we wanted. Therefore, we can be relatively certain that A is the correct answer.
Mr. Greenberg, Mr. Greenberg.
What is it, student me?
Aren't you going to read the other answer choices?
Well, student me, if you have the time, it's certainly not a bad idea to check the other answer choices. And if those of you following along at home want to pause and do that, go ahead. However, because we've done the work and determined what kind of information needs to go in the blank, and because answer A gives us exactly that, it probably isn't necessary. That's what's so great about solving questions with this logical approach. When you reach the correct answer, you're usually going to recognize it instantly. So let's move on to the next question. As usual, I'll begin by reading the question. Which choice best describes the function of the underlined sentence in the text as a whole? Now the question tells me that the focus will be the underlined sentence, but because I need to understand its function within the context of the text as a whole, I'm going to start reading from the beginning. The following text is from Edith Wharton's 1905 novel.
Mr. Greenberg, Mr. Greenberg.
What is it, student
Do
me?
we actually need to read the context?
Good question, student me. Need is an awfully strong word, but in general, I think it's a good idea to read the context. You'll notice that most passages on the digital SAT don't even have any context. So if you see context offered, it's an indication that you might need that context to understand the passage. Context is used most often for excerpts from a longer work, like a novel, so you may have a hard time understanding what's going on without reading it. So again, let's read the text starting with the context. The following text is from Edith Wharton's 1905 novel, The House of Mirth. Lily, Bart, and a companion are walking through a park. Lily had no real intimacy with nature, but she had a passion for the appropriate and could be keenly sensitive to a scene which was the fitting background of her own sensations. The landscape outspread below her seemed an enlargement of her present mood, and she found something of herself in its calmness, its breadth, and its long, free reaches. Now, I haven't read the final sentence, but I'm not sure I'll need to, because I've already read enough to begin analyzing the role of the sentence in the text as a whole. The sentence seems to be emphasizing the connection between Lily's mood and the landscape, and it builds on the sentence that comes before, which emphasizes Lily's view of nature as a fitting background of her own sensations. So with that in mind, I'm ready to move on to the answer choices. A. It creates a detailed image of the physical setting of the scene. Now this one may be tempting because it mentions physical setting, but the sentence in question doesn't really create a detailed image of that physical setting. Rather, it characterizes the setting as an extension of Lily's mood, so it's unlikely to be the correct answer. B. It establishes that a character is experiencing an internal conflict. So this one may also be tempting, because the passage does tell us about the internal situation of a character, Lily. However, because the dominant emotion is calmness, I don't see internal conflict, so I think I can cross off that one and move on. C. It makes an assertion that the next sentence then expands on. Now this one may be a bit harder because we haven't read the next sentence, so let's try that right now. On the nearer slopes the sugar maples wavered like pyres of light. Lower down was a massing of gray orchards, and here and there the lingering green of an oak grove. So that next sentence seems to be providing a physical description of the setting, but it's not really expanding on the assertion that the setting is an extension of Lily's mood. So I'd be hesitant to pick this as an answer, at least until I'm sure there's nothing better. Let's move on. D. It illustrates an idea that is introduced in the previous sentence. At last, we have an answer that matches our prediction. We've already established that the first sentence emphasizes Lily's view of nature as a fitting background of her own sensations, and that the underlined sentence expands upon that idea by portraying the setting as an extension of her mood. Therefore, we can pick answer D and move on. As usual, I'll start by reading the question. Which choice most logically completes the text? So I'm trying to complete the text, which means that the most important information is probably going to be in the final sentences. However, there may be essential context earlier in the passage too, so I'm going to read from the start. But I'm not going to let myself get too preoccupied with the details. Birds of many species ingest food containing carotenoids, pigmented molecules that are converted into feather coloration. Coloration tends to be especially saturated in male birds' feathers, and because carotenoids also confer health benefits, the deeply saturated colors generally serve to communicate what is known as an honest signal of the bird's overall fitness to potential mates. However, ornithologist Alison J. Schultz and others have found that in males in several species of the tanager genus R, use microstructures in their feathers to manipulate light, creating the appearance of deeper saturation, without the birds necessarily having to maintain a carotenoid-rich diet. These findings suggest that blank. Yikes. There were a lot of complicated science terms in that text, but I'm not going to let that distract me, and you shouldn't either. Instead, let's focus on transitions, and particularly the however in the middle of this text. So the first half of the text ends with the observation that deeply saturated colors are usually considered an honest signal of a bird's overall fitness, as they come from these carotenoids, which also confer health benefits. But in the second half, we can see that certain birds, tanagers, can find a way to create saturated colors without all these healthy carotenoids. So it seems that we're challenging the idea in the first half that saturated colors are an honest signal of a bird's overall fitness, and that's what I'm going to expect to go in the blank. Something related to the idea that deeply saturated colors are not always an honest signal of a bird's overall fitness. So let's examine those answer choices and see if we can find that. A. Individual male tanagers can engage in honest signaling without relying on carotenoid consumption. So this one fails to show that deeply saturated colors are not always an honest signal of a bird's fitness, so we can cross it off. B. Feather microstructures may be less effective than deeply saturated feathers for signaling overall fitness. This answer also fails to show that deeply saturated colors are not always going to be an honest signal of a bird's fitness, so we can cross it off too. C. Scientists have yet to determine why tanagers have a preference for mates with colorful appearances. Again, this has nothing to do with the idea that deeply saturated colors are not always an honest signal of a bird's fitness, so we can cross it off. Which leaves us with D. A male tanager's appearance may function as a dishonest signal of the individual's overall fitness. At last, an answer that closely matches our prediction. The male tanager's appearance, those deeply saturated colors, is a dishonest or not honest signal of its fitness. So we pick it and move on to the next question. As usual, let's start by reading the question. Which finding from Washington and Mulay-Nathan's study, if true, would most directly weaken the claim made by the people who favor the traditional view of voter behavior? Now, because I'm looking for information that would weaken the claim made by people who favor the traditional view of voter behavior, what I really need to know from the text is the traditional view of voter behavior. And when you get a passage that discusses a traditional view and a new view, the traditional view usually comes first. So I might expect the beginning of this passage is going to be the most important. That said, it may help me to understand Washington and Mulay-Nathan's study, so I'll probably just read the whole passage to be safe. Let's try that. Political scientists who favor the traditional view of voter behavior claim that voting in an election does not change a voter's attitude toward the candidates in that election. Focusing on each U.S. presidential election from 1976 to 1996, Abanya Washington and Senthil Mulay-Nathan tested this claim by distinguishing between subjects who had just become old enough to vote, around half of whom actually voted, and otherwise similar subjects who were slightly too young to vote, and thus none of whom voted. Washington and Mulay-Nathan compared the attitudes of the groups of subjects toward the winning candidate 2 years after each election. Now, as we predicted, the most important information was indeed in the first sentence. The traditional view of voter behavior is that voting in an election does not change a voter's attitude toward the candidates in that election. And because we're looking for something that would weaken that claim, we want to find an answer that suggests that voting in an election does change a voter's attitude. So the correct answer will probably show some difference between those who voted and those who didn't vote in terms of their attitude toward the candidates. Now let's examine the answer choices and see if we can find that. A. Subjects' attitude towards the winning candidate 2 years after a given election were strongly predicted by subjects' general political orientation, regardless of whether subjects were old enough to vote at the time of the election. So this answer suggests that whether or not subjects voted had no impact on their attitude, so it goes against our prediction and we can cross it off. B. Subjects who were not old enough to vote in a given election held significantly more positive attitudes toward the winning candidate 2 years later than they held at the time of the election. Now, this answer only tells us about the subjects who didn't vote. It doesn't tell us about the subjects who did vote, which means we don't have enough information to deduce that voting in the election changed their attitudes about the candidates. Therefore, we can cross it off. C. Subjects who voted in a given election held significantly more polarized attitudes toward the winning candidate 2 years later than did subjects who were not old enough to vote in that election. Now, this answer does tell us about the subjects who voted versus the subjects who didn't vote, and it also indicates a difference in their attitude, increased polarization. Therefore, it's a perfect match for our prediction, and I'm so confident it's the correct answer that I probably don't even need to read D. Although if you go ahead and try that, you'll see that it shows a similarity rather than a difference between voters and non-voters, confirming that C is, in fact, the correct answer. Now let's move on to the next question. As usual, we'll start by reading the question. Which choice best states the main purpose of the text? So the question is asking for the main purpose of the text, which means it's probably a good idea to read the whole text. And when we do, we should think not just about what is being said, but why it's being said. So let's try that. The following text is adapted from Jane Austen's 1814 novel Mansfield Park. The speaker, Tom, is considering staging a play at home with a group of his friends and family. We mean nothing but a little amusement among ourselves, just to vary the scene, and exercise our powers in something new. We want no audience, no publicity. We may be trusted, I think, in choosing some play most perfectly unexceptionable, and I can conceive no greater harm or danger to any of us in conversing in the elegant written language of some respectable author than in chattering in words of our own. So the text seems to be focusing on Tom and his friends' motivations for staging the play, and he seems to be downplaying the risk, insisting that they're just doing it for a little amusement, and that it poses no greater harm or danger. So the purpose of the passage seems to be to show Tom's assertion that the play is going to be harmless. With that in mind, let's move on to the answers. A. To offer Tom's assurance that the play will be inoffensive and involve only a small number of people. Now here's an answer that seems fairly close to our prediction. We predicted harmless, and here it says inoffensive. The only part we may have some doubts about is where it says a small number of people. But looking back at the passage, the fact that they want no audience and are only doing it among themselves seemed to match, which means we found our answer. Time permitting, I'd still probably want to read the rest of the answers, and I encourage you to do that for yourself, but I can be pretty confident even without reading them. And so rather than wasting your time right now, I'm going to move on to the next question. As usual, we'll start by reading the question. Which choice best describes data from the table that support Barrett and Rayfield's suggestion? Now, in order to find information from the table that would support Barrett and Rayfield's suggestion, we need to first understand Barrett and Rayfield's suggestion. So I'm going to read through the text, focusing my attention on information that's going to help me understand their suggestion. Let's try that now together. The largest tyrannosaurids, the family of carnivorous dinosaurs that includes Tarbosaurus, Albertosaurus, and most famously Tyrannosaurus rex, are thought to have had the strongest bites of any land animals in Earth's history. Determining the bite force of extinct animals can be difficult, however, and paleontologists Paul Barrett and Emily Rayfield have suggested that an estimate of dinosaur bite force may be significantly influenced by the methodology used in generating that estimate. So it seems that Barrett and Rayfield's suggestion is that the methodology used has a significant impact on the estimate of an animal's bite force. So we're going to be looking for an answer that suggests that different methodologies can lead to different estimates. And remember that it also has to be true according to the table. So let's try that. So first we'll look at A. The study by Mears used body mass scaling and produced the lowest estimated maximum bite force, while the study by Cost et al. Used muscular and skeletal modeling and produced the highest estimated maximum. Now this answer does suggest that different methodologies lead to different estimates, which means it matches our prediction. However, it suggests that the study by Mears yielded the lowest estimate, which is clearly not true according to the graph, so we can reject it and move on. B. In their study, Gignac and Erickson used bone-tooth interaction analysis to produce an estimated bite force range with a minimum of 8,000 newtons and a maximum of 34,000 newtons. Now this answer doesn't talk about different methodologies being used, so even though it may be true according to the graph, it doesn't give us what we need, and we can reject it and move on. C. The bite force estimates produced by Bates and Falkingham and by Cost et al. Were similar to each other, while the estimates produced by Mears and by Gignac and Erickson each differed substantially from any other estimate. Now to interpret this answer, we're going to need to look a little bit closer. The answer choice doesn't directly mention methodologies, but it does tell us that Bates and Falkingham and Cost et al. Produced similar estimates, and looking at the chart, we can see that they also used the same estimation methodology. Meanwhile, it tells us that the estimates by Mears and Gignac and Erickson differed from other estimates. And we'll notice that not only is this true, but also that those particular studies also used different methods. Therefore, answer C gives us information that is true, and it also suggests that different methodologies can lead to different estimates. Therefore, we can pick it and move on. Now, if you've been counting, you may have realized that this is the last question we'll be solving in this video. So before we jump into it, a quick public service announcement. I recently started an Instagram account where I will be posting regular practice questions for the digital SAT. I also have a website full of free resources for the digital SAT, ivyleaguementorsprep.com. I'll leave information to both of those in the description so you can check them out and find me there. Now back to the video. As usual, let's begin by reading the question. Which choice most effectively uses data from the table to complete the statement? So this tells me that I'll need to find information that will help me complete the statement, which is most likely to occur near the end of the passage. But it may also include important information earlier, so I'm just going to be reading from the beginning. Let's try that together. Mycorrhizal fungi in soil benefits many plants, substantially increasing the mass of some. A student conducted an experiment to illustrate this effect. The student chose 3 plant species for the experiment, including 2 that are mycorrhizal hosts, species known to benefit from mycorrhizal fungi, and 1 non-mycorrhizal species, a species that doesn't benefit and may even be harmed by mycorrhizal fungi. The student then grew several plants from each species, both in soil containing mycorrhizal fungi and in soil that had been treated to kill mycorrhizal fungi and other fungi. After several weeks, the student measured the plant's average mass and was surprised to discover that blank. So the big clue is in the final sentence, just as we predicted. I'm talking about the word surprised. So what goes in the blank is going to be something that surprised the student. And to determine what would surprise the student, we need to know the student's expectations. We see that in the experiment, the student exposed mycorrhizal hosts and non-hosts to soil with and without mycorrhizal fungi. And mycorrhizal fungi is expected to benefit the hosts, but it says that it could even harm the non-hosts. Since the student was surprised, we want something that goes against that. So the correct answer could show that mycorrhizal hosts are not benefiting from the fungi, or it could show that non-hosts are benefiting from the fungi. It also needs to be true according to the table. So with those considerations in mind, let's move on to our answer choices. A. Broccoli grown in soil containing mycorrhizal fungi had a slightly higher average mass than broccoli grown in soil that had been treated to kill fungi. So the answer doesn't tell us anything about hosts and non-hosts, but looking at the chart, I see that broccoli is not a host, which means that mycorrhizal fungi would be expected to not help or even to harm it. But the answer tells me that broccoli grown in the soil with the fungi had a higher mass, which means that this result would indeed surprise the student. It also matches the information in the chart, which indicates that broccoli with the fungi had a mass of 7.5, which is more than the one grown in the soil without the fungi, 7.0. Therefore, the answer has everything that we need, and we can pick it with confidence. So there you have it, 7 of the hardest reading questions from the digital SAT. But when we tackle them with a logical approach, I think they're not so bad. For those of you who are solving along at home, I wonder what you thought. Did anybody manage to get them all? And are there other hard questions that you'd like to see me solve in future videos? Feel free to leave a comment below. As always, thanks for watching and good luck on the test.